Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that sounds straightforward, but really isn't always. The difference between real property and personal property.
Seems basic, right?
Yeah, exactly. But we're going to unpack it using your sources, looking at why getting this distinction right is, well, incredibly important if you're buying, selling, or even just leasing.
Absolutely. Knowing these details, these nuances, can definitely save you from some major headaches down the line. And honestly, it gives you a fascinating look at what we truly uh, own versus what we don't.
Okay, so let's jump right in. When we talk about real property, my first thought is just, the land itself and
Mm.
buildings on it. Is that basically it, or?
That's a solid starting point, but yeah, there's a bit more to it. Real property isn't just the physical land and the stuff attached like buildings or, say, landscaping.
Okay.
It also includes the associated benefits, the rights, the ownership interests that kind of inherently go with that land. Your sources mentioned the term appurtenance for those rights.
Appurtenance. You can give me an example?
Sure. Think about maybe an easement to cross a neighbor's property to get to yours. That right-of-way is an appurtenance. It's not physical land you own, but it's a right attached to your land. It passes along when the property sells.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So it's the land, the fixed improvements, and these attached rights.
Exactly.
But here's where I think it gets tricky for a lot of people. What about things inside the house? Like a ceiling fan or the kitchen stove. Are those real property?
Ah, yeah, that's a classic point of confusion. This is where we need to differentiate between accessories and fixtures.
Okay.
An accessory, well, it might be something like a stove or maybe a window air conditioner. It could be installed, sure,
Yeah.
but it doesn't necessarily have to be part of the structure.
Right. Movable.
Right. But a fixture, now that's different. A fixture is something that started as personal property. Like you bought the ceiling fan at the store, but then it became real property because it was permanently attached or installed.
Permanently. How permanent is permanent, though?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do you actually determine if something crossed that line and truly became a fixture?
Yeah.
There are these tests of a fixture that courts often look at. First is the method of attachment. How is it actually fixed? Is it bolted, wired in, cemented?
Like really stuck on there.
Sort of. Second is adaptation. Was it specifically adapted or like custom built for that particular property? Custom bookshelves built into an alcove.
Makes sense.
And the third, and often the most debated one, is the intention of the party who attached it. What did they mean for it to be when they installed it?
Ooh, intention. That sounds subjective. How do you prove that if people disagree later?
It absolutely can be subjective, and that's where disputes often pop up, especially during sales. Was that fancy chandelier intended to stay or go? It often comes down to what's written in the sales contract or what's considered standard practice in the area.
So get it in writing.
Always the best advice. And just to flip that coin, there's also severance. Yeah, that's when something that was real property, a fixture, gets detached or uninstalled and becomes personal property again.
Ah, like taking out that built-in bookcase before you sell.
Exactly. But critically, that usually needs agreement. You can't just decide to sever all the light fixtures after you sign a contract to sell the house with light fixtures.
Right. Okay, so if fixtures become real property, what about everything else? My sofa, my TV, my coffee maker.
That's all personal property. Simple as that. Sometimes called chattel or personality. Basically anything temporary or movable that isn't classified as real property.
And how does that get transferred if you're selling a house and maybe leaving the washing machine?
Good question. Ownership of personal property is typically transferred using a separate document called a bill of sale. If it's part of a real estate deal, you'd often use an addendum to the main contract or that separate bill of sale to clearly list what personal items are included.
Okay. This brings up, are there any common mix-ups or maybe surprising examples where these lines get blurred?
Definitely. One really important area is commercial versus residential property, specifically leases.
How so?
Well, in a typical residential lease, if a tenant installs a fixture, say a new ceiling light, it usually becomes part of the landlord's real property and stays when the tenant leaves.
Right. You don't usually take the lights with you.
Exactly. But in commercial leases, it's different. We have something called trade fixtures. These are things installed by a business tenant specifically for their business. Think display cases in a shop or specialized ovens in a restaurant.
Okay.
The key difference is that the tenant can usually remove these trade fixtures before their lease ends. They're considered necessary for the business. But if they don't remove them by the time the lease is up,
They become the
They
landlords.
become the landlord's real property. So if you're buying a commercial building with tenants, you really need to verify who owns what fixtures. Could be a big deal.
Wow, yeah, I can see that. Any other, like, really unexpected example?
One of my favorites is emblements.
Emblements. Never heard of that.
It refers to annually cultivated crops, things like corn, wheat, barley, stuff a farmer plants and expects to harvest within the year.
Okay, crops. They're attached to the land, right? So they must be real property.
See, that's what's fascinating. Even though they are literally growing out of the ground, emblements are generally considered the personal property of the farmer who cultivated them.
Really? So if someone sells their farm mid-season,
The crops don't automatically go with the farm sale.
hmm,
The farmer who planted them usually retains the right to come back and harvest that specific crop just that one time once it's ready, even after the sale closes.
that is surprising. It really highlights how intention and the type of attachment matter.
Okay, so wrapping this up, it's clear these aren't just, dusty legal terms. Understanding real versus personal property, fixtures, severance, emblements, it really empowers you whether you're buying, selling, renting.
Absolutely. It fundamentally shapes what you own or what you're getting in a transaction. And maybe a final thought to leave you with.
Beyond the legal papers, think about the intent behind things in your own space. What did you intend when you installed that shelf or planted that rose bush? Looking around with this lens of real versus personal property, you might be surprised at what's considered permanent versus what's potentially movable. It's an interesting way to think about our relationship with the spaces we occupy.